I don't care who you are. Nobody is perfect, and we never will be. No matter how much work you put into it, you will reveal your contradictions again, and you will be welcomed and opened into the embodied knowledge of a new radical way of thinking through that. The quest isn't, I need to already know what is good and bad, but I need to somehow train my body to be able to receive information about how my contradictions might be affecting other people. And instead of lashing into a sense of urgency to reclaim a sort of pure identity, to be able to remain in that mud and play in that mud for a little while and say, can I be curious about what this reveals about me? Can I be curious about what this reveals about you? Can I be curious about, new things that I might need to understand my nervous system needs?
Do you want to just... I actually just started recording just to make sure that everything's good. Do you want to just launch into it?
Yeah.
Do you want to take a second to like talk about the outline of the conversation or whatever?
No, I'm fine to just jump right into it. The only thing is I'm going to take 2 seconds to open up a can of sparkling water, and I don't want that to
Beautiful.
mess up your recording.
Well, can you do it into your microphone, actually?
Oh shit, I already did it.
Okay.
Oh man,
okay.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. Just the sparkling water?
Yeah.
I've got a coffee. Got a little cold brew.
I've already had 2 cups today, man, and that's one more than I normally do.
Nice. Well, good to hear your voice. So who are you? And what do you do?
Well, my name is V, and I think asking what I do is very complicated because I kind of do a lot of things. I'm a multimedia artist and ritualist and a person deeply invested in investigating relational ethics, mostly centered around how we can provide care where hegemony tricks us into behaviors of harm.
I kind of became aware of you through your online presence and a lot of visual content that you're putting out. And can you describe that a little bit? Particularly, I was interested in these costumes or garments that you were wearing that seemed to be self-crafted, and you're kind of going through the town. I would guess it's either a town in Texas or New Orleans, and in these different costumes. And can you tell us a little bit of that before we get into the relational writing and experiences you've been processing and philosophizing about?
Sure, yeah. What a question. I love that question. I love costuming. I also kind of love being a creature. It's hard to say whether the photos you were talking about were in Texas or in New Orleans because I think I was creaturing in both places. I kind of have this impression of the way people perceive garmeting as a way to kind of veil one's true nakedness so that it decreases the intensity of having to encounter another person like truly nude in the ontological sense of the word. And like garmeting becomes kind of a mediary where I can still say like encounter me as this creature, encounter me as something feral, so that as opposed to like using garmenting as a way to hide from what is real, I'm merely just trying to mediate that intensity while still announcing a real in a way that others might find more digestible than just like approaching them with the fullness of my creaturing all at once. Does that make sense?
I think it's an interesting and compelling way to phrase it. It's like, are you trying to say that like a costume or a garment or a creaturing, like a performance of those of creatureliness, the fact that it's performed can make it more digestible than a less mediated version of it?
Yes and no. Like I'm the first point is that we're always dressing in a garment and we're always performing this kind of mediation. And what we choose to garment ourselves as then in my mind becomes a reflection of how we are encountered by the other. And I think that one can sometimes use garments to shield themselves from being seen just as much as one can use the garment to like show what is being seen without forcing the other to digest them in a full intensity without mediation.
Mm-hmm.
I also do not think that everyone is implicitly like identifying with creatureliness. I use that word because my costumes are always some sort of creature. Like if you go on my website and you look at, I have like a section of all of these different modeling shoots I've done. And in one, I'm a bird. And in one, I'm like some wearing antlers on my head and in the woods. And in another, I'm wearing this bunny mask, this like balaclava that has bunny ears. So it's just anytime I make a costume, I try to demonstrate, like, hey, if you encounter me, be aware that creatureliness is a part of the expression you will be engaging with. But I don't assume that all people who are using costumes to veil but also seduce the other with the real like needs that to be a creature the same way I do, if that makes sense.
Sure. Yeah, I think there's something about performance and costuming that both disguises and reveals. And I think that it's interesting to think about the ways in which that reveals how nakedness itself could be both a disguise or a veil or a actual revelation. You know, it's one of those things where
Absolutely.
like drag, for example, reveals the arbitrariness of gender perceptions to begin with, even among like cis people or whatever. In a similar way, like
100%.
performance of creatureliness. I know that you're not trying to make it universal, but it still kind of like infects the everyday understanding of like identity within a singular kind of bounded species identified body, right?
Yes. Yeah, 100%. And I definitely would say that my queer ancestors were inspiration for me, like understanding that performance and costuming did not have to be quote unquote acting. Like it could actually just become a mediation of of a revelation, like you said. But revelation is deeply destabilizing, and so it kind of requires this sort of uh, mediation in order to be digested, which I think is really cool. I think that's really cool. I love ontological nudity, but I would not forsake clothes or costumes for some sort of like pure transcendental Garden of Eden nakedness either.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I love that. I mean, like, we live in a world of artifice and masks, and also that plays out among so many different forms. The most essential thing you can find embodied will oftentimes have like masks and veils as well. I think that that's an interesting way to segue a little bit, and I'm still going to maybe ask you to kind of lay out a kind of structured overview of starting with this exegesis that you wrote, and then these 3 essays that I think that are like the love is the law, love under will, and do what thou wilt, processing sort of relational harm and thinking through it in a more systemic and holistic way. But I think that maybe a good way to kind of enter into that, from this discussion of surfaces and costumes and the visual, would be this concept of the visual itself in conversation with like this idea of immediacy, or of like understanding something quickly. That's kind of comes up in the essays, and I wonder if you could maybe spell that out a little bit, if you see what I'm trying to get at.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, all of my work does essentially revolve around the theme of how to remain with uncertainty. I think remain is the word I was looking for. I feel as if my understanding of existential philosophy is that and this comes from being a student of the philosophy of religious studies, where I have written entire 100+ page theses on both existential philosophy, self-formation, and at one point in time Buddhist philosophy. So I really have constantly been trying to hold the reality that there is no stable self. And when I was in my undergrad in philosophy, I was all on the internet, and I loved my little philosophy meme pages. And I can't remember most of those memes anymore, but the one meme from that period of time I'll probably never forget is like the stick figure lying in bed, staring up at the ceiling, and the text was like, second year philosophy student, you know, reading about existential philosophy and there being no self for the first time. And the reason why I remember that is because that was so viscerally my experience, when I was in my undergrad, is just like the shock of, well, now that you have presented me with these arguments that I do agree with, that there is no such thing as a stable self, I feel completely disoriented. I don't know how to organize a will. I don't know where my grounds are supposed to be anymore. And so the only thing I can do is just lay in bed and stare at the ceiling and like hope that will to orient myself will arise at some point. And in a lot of ways, my answer to these questions has changed a lot since I was an undergrad, but that need to be able to sustain myself within, what Heidegger would call the fallenness, or what Sartre would call that state of nausea. Um, I feel like I've reached a point of refusal that I need to feel a falling or that I need to experience a nausea. And I have instead, especially through the work I did with Anne Carson in my master's program, I am really instead trying to figure out if there is a way that I can reorient myself in time such that I allow the passage of time to be like that Heraclidian river that is constantly flowing, that I can't stand on with sturdy legs, or even stay in the same ground of water more than at each moment in time. How can I be in that water, in that flowing, and somehow also maintain a certain sense of what I am now referring to as quote unquote sea legs? So I don't know that I've ever really spelled that out. And maybe, this is a moment for me to write something else down in my idea box. That maybe there should be an essay where I explain that more explicitly. But you're absolutely correct that that is the underlining, like, point of origin of all the rest of the questions and concerns that come up in my work.
Like going through like Western thought, Western philosophical canon, you get like these deconstructions of identity. And you also get to understand like the actual construction of identity. And so, but once you get to understand that it's constructed, and you start to understand these feelings of like Sartre's, nausea, then the question becomes, well, like, how do you really wrestle without be having the sense of obliteration,
Yes.
right? To paraphrase.
Yes, exactly. Yes, 100%. Like, my critique of the Western canon ends up being, you know, for example, Baudrillard insists on the simulation as point in fact. We can't escape it. This is just how it is. This is just how we perceive now. We've completely fucked ourselves. And even though it's not nihilistic in the actual philosophic sense of the word, it is nihilistic in the colloquial sense of the word. It's basically like we can't do anything other than reveal this mechanism, so I guess we just give up. At least that's my impression. I would be so happy to hear people who specialize in Baudrillard or Sartre to come and tell me I'm wrong and show me the passages why, because that would make my job easier. But those are not the people I really specialized in. I specialized in, Buddhist philosophy and Nagarjuna, and then in Anne Carson. And Anne Carson, I think I was drawn to her originally because my program would not let me write. They didn't want me to write about Bataille, who is a longtime love of mine. And I like that you use that word obliteration because, Bataille is another one of these people who is just like infatuated almost with this critique and then it completely embraces annihilation as the response to it. And for as much as I adore him and know that he actually was a leftist comrade, I believe that that in and of itself is a part of the reason why people like Nick Land have been able to take up Bataille's work and advocate for accelerationism. I think Anne Carson, though she never explicitly talks about Bataille, she does explicitly talk about Heidegger and Baudrillard, but it's only other scholars, like scholars writing about Anne Carson, that I've ever seen compare her to Bataille. But they're both philosophers of eroticism, and they both embrace poetry as a mode of philosophic writing that can potentially alleviate philosophy from this more hegemonic, from its more hegemonic forms. But Anne Carson doesn't advocate for annihilation. She advocates for learning to be in relation with time. And I've come to understand and articulate this in my own words as, a lot of people like to claim that capitalism is a philosophy of death. I reject that. I think that any philosophy of death is also a philosophy of life, because these two things work in a dialectic with each other.
Absolutely.
I
There's
think the
biopower and
issue,
micropower, yeah.
yeah, I think the issue is that we are claiming death is the opposite of life. This is implicitly the issue. And then we suspend ourselves outside of time as a way to avoid the grief, the various griefs that being a self, and experiencing an other, and having to endure both death of the self and death of the other. And we want so badly to avoid those deaths, or to rush towards those deaths, and as a rejection of life, which is, accelerationism. We want so badly to not have to deal with the actual weight of time, that we have suspended ourselves out of it in place of, some sort of modality of transcendence, or, and here's my religious studies background coming in, like some sort of reach towards a life immortality. I'm sorry to have to say Christianity is a big reason why we seem to have done this, but to ever assume that there was a way out of this cycle, and to organize all our morals and values as social creatures around this idea that there is a possible way to completely remove ourselves from the process of life and death, like that to me is what capitalism is. And so it's not about life versus death, it's about life versus suspension outside of time. Does that make sense?
Life versus suspension outside of time. Yeah. You said dealing with the weight of time, I think something you mentioned also was related to the horror not of death but of incarnation, or the
Yep.
The grief. You said the grief of of actually being here, as opposed to engaging with life and other people, rather than the grief of parting, or the grief of losing some sort of world. It's like the grief of having this world is pretty wild. And I think that squares with this idea of care, the specter of care, that I think I've been orienting my own philosophical working with and life experience towards. It's sort of this direction away from empathy as the guiding value, and towards care as the guiding value. I think because that implicates a thick co-presence that is not definitive, it's not clean or definitive or certain, and that requires some humility in a lot of different ways, intellectually and in a very grounded way. And I think that kind of goes counter to a lot of the aspirational thinking and teleological thinking that is pretty endemic to Western thought and society. If I can just get in my bag, then I'll be good. Or if I can just get, this achievement or that achievement, then I will be lovable. Or if we can just get through this apocalypse, then we can finally have the relief of death, or of reset or of rebirth or whatever. But yeah, it's your intervention seems to be that the arena, the area of intervention is just the ever present presence.
Yes and no. First, I would say I love your phrasing distinguishing empathy versus care, because that is in alignment with how I'm thinking or what I'm thinking through. Not that it's the only way to think things through, but that is in alignment with my particular mode. Because empathy is an idea, care is embodied. And that to me is the distinction. Like, what I reject is how the icon, the idealized sign, the idealized image in this platonic way, the ideal form, has replaced our experience or even our desire to experience the real. And so, man, I forgot what I was going to say. You're mistaken. You're like, it was your last couple of sentences that I was like,
well, I was kind of implying, I was positing that maybe your intervention is engaged in like an eternal present. I don't know if that's what you had. Yeah.
No, I reject that only because I was convinced by Anne Carson. If you read her book, Eros the Bittersweet, she actually addresses that through this like wonderful story from Aristotle's Phaedrus, where Aristotle is telling the story of the cicada and how the cicada, from the time they are born, just begin this eternal singing. They're eternally locked in the ecstasy of the now. They forget to eat, they forget to drink. They don't do anything other than arise, sing, and then die. And I'm not saying, I'm not an entomologist. I'm not saying that's actually what cicadas do. I'm saying this was the story from the Phaedra. And her point about this, or her own understanding of this that she's presenting to the reader through Eros the Bittersweet, is that this is still a refusal of time. I'm not suggesting that we exist in an eternal now, but that we allow now to dialogically exist alongside the distance between my past and my future. Does that make sense?
I'm curious because I'm curious if you can like continue to expand on this distinction, because there is a common kind of like leftist esoteric, parapower idea of actually it's funny, of like Coronos, right? Of this like the time being imposed on a natural timelessness. So like the type of time that we have with hours and the calendar and with years is a type of prison. Like that's kind of like a meme you see in esoteric circles and stuff, is like, oh man, like when can I escape the eternal cycle? Saturn in the black, yes. And I think so. I guess I'm interested. Where does like Anne Carson's and your conception of time fit within that structure? And yeah, is it trying to say that like, no, we need to like work with that time?
Well, I cannot put exact words into her mouth. I can say what my understanding of what I've learned through her, as well as my engagement as an occultist who at one point in time specialized in Saturn. I mean, my whole entire project is called SaturnVox. The way I understand this is that we have organized ourselves in such a way that time has become a prison. But it doesn't, like, we can imagine possibility of a world where that isn't how things have to be. Of course, like, I do think that's true in a certain sense. Like, my time is forced to be organized in such a way that, it becomes a part of the mode of value. But I think that isn't implicitly the state of time as time is a priori. I think it is a way that we have come to define and organize ourselves around time. So that's number one. Number two is like the thing I think Carson is advocating for, and what I am certainly advocating for, is that, we accept that time shapes the present. I cannot escape my past. My past is a part of the self formation of who I am. And my reach towards the future and my desires for the future and my drive to create in a future context is also a part of my self formation. I am never a self existing outside of time. But certainly, does it need to be organized in minutes, hours, blah, blah, blah? No, a lot of that was socially formulated, so that trains could arrive on time, sort of thing. But some of it is obviously more helpful so that I could plan a meeting with you so we could get together and not miss each other. It doesn't always have to be a prison, but it's often used as such, if that makes sense. Gosh, I wish I wouldn't say that so much, but yes.
I mean, I feel like it's once again one of those things about incarnation. I mean, where the body that we have is, you could also identify, you could see that as a prison if you wanted to, or you could see it as a experimental framework, like a canvas or like a grid that you can build upon or build within or understand differently.
Exactly.
Sure, yeah. And I mean, it's very Saturn. It's very Saturnian. The perhaps the creative capacity of Saturn's limits, right?
Well, to think of it's like when anything is possible. When I was learning how to write poetry, and I took a poetry class in my undergrad, the main thing I remember from that class is when my teacher basically said, like, think about how difficult it is to write a poem just with a blank page and no rules or no limits on what to build. And you almost kind of hit, like, your mind starts to expand in potentiality and multiplicity so much that it freezes. Either that or you're frozen and you can't come up with anything at all. When you do things like I say, I'm going to write this poem in iambic pentameter, or I'm going to do a found poem just using different lines, or, whatever. You can be creative with the limit, but setting limits actually allows for a more curious type of play with your creative expression, because it gives you something you can actually digest and manage.
I think that it could be time to turn to this exegesis. It's funny. It's interesting to think about the erotic play between people and love as something that also thrives through limits.
If there was no limit between self and other, this very thing that causes the existential grief or that causes all this pain, if there wasn't that, then I would have no room to creatively play in the material kingdom at all. So it is a grief, but it's a necessary grief in order for there to be the game of life. And that is both a tragedy and something to be celebrated. As hard as it is to hold those two things at once, my goal is to juggle those two modalities. But yeah, we can certainly move to talk about the exegesis. I thought of that, so I wanted to say it.
Exactly. That's a really good way to sum it up. That makes sense. I like that grief is a part of this intrinsically, so to speak. Would you mind if I like read a couple stanzas from the exegesis real quick?
Oh,
Or would
sure.
you?
Yeah, go
Yeah,
right
okay, yeah.
ahead.
So these are not. I recommend everybody go. It's SaturnVox.com, and then there's like there's the exegesis on the Gospel of V, and then there's 3 essays: Love is the Law, Love Under Will, and Do What Thou Wilt. I definitely recommend going through them, and they're pretty. Exegesis in particular is pretty extensive, but I don't know. I'm just going to be picking out a couple little things just to get us started. So it says, quote, "I cannot start at the beginning. That extends the scope. But I can say this. There was a moment when she looked at me like something holy had just arrived." And then later, "As the lore goes, monsters always mark a threshold. I was just trying to survive something impossible. Not just the relationship, but the way that Eros comes with the wings of change. Change isn't tidy. It doesn't move in a line. It doesn't announce itself cleanly in the body just because the mind has already understood it." Unquote. So I think that is kind of like, again, kind of allows us to segue from the intellectual sort of like preamble that we did into maybe some more situated thinking, because those words contain, first of all, a poetic remembrance of time and a memory in time. There was a moment when she looked at me like something holy had just arrived. And I think that there is like, you can already like feel a sense of grief from that, even though it's a beautiful moment. And then later, this idea of like implicating the monster as a marker of a threshold, and then going into this idea that this was a paradoxical situation, the survival in impossible circumstances, and this inevitable, messy change that kind of attends that as well. Would you be interested in summarizing what this exegesis is and why you use the term exegesis?
Well, the exegesis is really, for the longest time, I was just calling it my abuse story before it had a name. And I guess that is still, to some degree, the best summary. It's a narrative of the abuse I had experienced in a culture. Well, why did I call it an exegesis? Was because a part of what the abuse was is that there was a lot of harmful stories being spread about me and said about me behind closed doors and behind my back. And I was not invited to these conversations, like not even once. There was never actually a real moment of true conflict. These stories were just because of a certain way that social capital works. They were just accepted, and I was never allowed to tell my own story. So the reason why I chose to call it an exegesis was partially because, yes, like I was also in my graduate program when I was writing it, and the semester I chose to write it, I took a class on. I was a religious studies major, so I took a class on visions and visionaries and people who like wrote exegesis, which were often, people's interpretation of religious texts, but could also be these fantastic stories told of a visionary experience. And, to me, because my story had to do with abuse that I experienced within the world of a culture where, visions were happening, magic was happening, spirits were being consulted, it did already feel very mythic to like retell this story as like, I could have written this as a fantasy novel just as much kind of thing. But also because like part of my point, it was in my second semester I took a class with Jeff Kripal, who is a person who he's a scholar who writes about the modern day mystic. That's one way to summarize what he does. Like for a post-Nietzschean world where God is dead, who is the visionary become, or who is the mystic become, and how do they explain themselves or write or talk about themselves now? And he specializes in like UAP encounters. So like one of the ways he does this is talking about, the modern day visionary is the person who's having, alien experiences and that sort of thing. And we read in his class, we had to read VALIS.
Mm-hmm.
And not that I have ever read it, but Philip K. Dick did also write like the exegesis of Philip K. Dick, which is kind of a compendium or like it's a part of or a deeper analysis of, everything that was happening within VALIS. And so I was kind of inspired by that because I still do consider myself a person who has visionary experiences and therefore struggles with how to articulate that intensity to others and even to myself. And what does a visionary do when they are, receiving these quote unquote downloads or having these quote unquote mystical experiences? Well, they write it down. So it was both a response to the fact that I was being silenced in a real social way, and that I had so much intensity building up inside of me that I just needed to express my story in a way that felt real to me, and in this way the mythic is the real. If I'm not going to say if that makes sense again.
Yeah, the mythic as the real. So. Am I wrong to sort of like make a connection between essentially this experience of abuse and a visionary experience?
The abuse occurred through a variety of different people's experiences of visions and spirit communication and blah blah blah. And that's why the sections that you read from, which are from the Sasha speech, those are deeply about friendship and love. And it's funny because I'm going through that text. I've been re-going through the exegesis over the past couple of days, and I've only made it through the Sasha speech so far, and it's kind of crazy to me how much they are really saying a similar thing as the other three essays about love and will. But the Jesse speech begins a kind of deeper analysis that is talking about spiritual authority and how we can hold care in a priestly context, which is, when I think about Hierophant in the tarot as being the one who receives these visions from, the sacred, or the beyond, maybe is a better word, from the beyond, and then transposes them into a book of law that is then shared with the community as like a here's how we should organize ourselves, so saith the spider sort of thing. Like that's kind of in my mind what the priest archetype or the Hierophant archetype does, whether it is doing this in a hegemonic way or a, more feral, more anti-capitalist way. That's a part of why when you say the exegesis is extensive, it's like, holy shit. Yeah, when I look at the PDF and I saw it was 111 pages, I was like, holy shit. But a part of that is because it's written in poetic form, so there's like a lot of line breaks. I think it's really, if you set it up like a normal text, it would probably be half that. But yeah, it explores 3 different modalities of abuse, and where abuse occurred through particular relational harm. And the middle section is this more like the class of the priest, and how does the priest hold care. So in that way, I wouldn't say that the abuse, it was synonymous with visionary experiences, but because visionary experiences were being responded to through modalities of power that were extremely harmful and abusive, that is implicitly a part of the story.
Right, right. And it's almost like perhaps, yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's like almost like the emergence of the exegesis is like channeling the same kind of, I don't know, maybe it's just kind of borrowing the same kind of Hierophant energy, and continuing it out into an understanding, like a self-analysis, like an analysis of the power structures within which you experience like harm.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. When I was like reading this, I remember I kind of like had this craving to be like, oh my God, like just like what happened? Like what happened? Like tell me what happened. And you kind of get to it obliquely through the narrative. But I think that there is something interesting about this kind of yearning to be like, oh my God, just tell me what happens, which I think is once again is tempered by this idea that you find that out through time, through reading through this narrative. And it's not something where it's not like call out post. This isn't strictly a call out. It's not saying this thing happened to me by this person. It's laying it out across time. It's bringing you into the experience. I don't know. Do you have anything about that that you want to talk about? Do you think that that's a intentional dynamic? And also, in that context, like, are you interested in discussing like what happened for like listeners, or would it be better just to direct them to the piece?
I mean, truly, yeah, I'm happy to answer both of those questions. Essentially, the form of the exegesis was chosen very intentionally, which is ironic. It was an experiment, and I knew it was an experiment because I had never attempted to think. Part of what happened is that once again in my life, probably happens to me a lot. I don't know if it's more than the average person, but once again, I had experienced a loss of all my ontological grounds, especially around, in this case, pedagogy, where, like, for as much as I had already considered myself a person who was deeply interested in ethics, I had not completely relinquished the previous grounds I had inherited from Western hegemony. And when that hit me, one of the things I realized was that implicitly the way we write text teaches people how to think. And it's so funny because it's not like I had never read Paulo Freire before. But it's almost like maybe other people can identify with this, but and I do talk about this in the exegesis a little bit, although I don't think I explicitly phrase it like this, but it's like there's a deep difference between a theoretical knowledge and an embodied knowledge. And it was like prior to this very traumatic experience, I had a lot of theory with no embodied knowledge. And the embodied knowledge hit me like a shock. and caused deeper understanding of a lot of theories I already quote unquote knew. And one of these from Pedagogy of the Oppressed is that, part of how we learn to think hierarchically is because we have knowledge deposited into us when we are children by authority figures, whether that's your parents, your priest, or your school teacher. And it's a very top down form of knowledge exchange where those who know just tell you how something is, as opposed to engaging with you in dialogue and kind of inspiring you to feel and experience and with your own sovereign agency come to the knowledge yourself. And so the exegesis was my very first experiment. I feel like all my writing now is further experiments of trying to figure out how to make sure that my text matches the theory instead of being written like a scholarly essay or presented to you like how I've been trained to write an essay or what I'm even trained to think an essay is allowed to be. I challenged myself to ask, like, what is the actual point of the essay and how can I find a form that allows the reader to sit inside that theory instead of, using the master's tools to critique them, so to speak. So your point that the essay kind of forces you to sit through uncertainty, forces you to sit through confusion, forces you to sometimes feel the intensity of I was about to use third person uh feel the intensity of my experience as if like you yourself are being weighted down by it. That was all intentional because I didn't want to just deposit a story into you. I wanted you to experience the story along with me. um I do think that that experiment was a failure because a lot of people did not understand it. Like you
Oh,
said, like
yes.
what happened? What happened? Like as far as I'm concerned, it does tell you what happened. I try to spell it out. Why do you think I took 111 pages? Like I'm trying so hard to explain to you what happened, but it gets lost. And so that's fine. It was my first experiment, and we don't learn anything without failure. So it was a very public failure, but that's also okay.
Well, I
Um,
mean, I don't know if it is completely a failure. I mean, it's perhaps challenging, right? It's maybe a challenging text. But but I mean, like, you're probably going to say this, but like, the, very, like, the urge to be like, what happened? Just tell me what happened in simple terms. If you're saying you experienced abuse and harm, then I should know exactly what it was that harmed or abused you, which I think, as we will continue to spell out, like, and from our pre-conversation, it seems, and from the text itself, it's, you are not interested in doing that because that is a reduction of actual care, you know?
yes, yes, exactly. I don't, I think I don't have to get into what a lot of leftists already know because it might be not valuable to our time. But, like cancel culture and a lot of like more liberal rhetoric really only intensifies the firm stance of the other side. It doesn't produce a relational response even if it's correct. And that is just a part of, how we as humans operate socially. I'm not suggesting that that is, implicitly the only way that we can operate socially, but I am saying that the, material conditions and the historical conditions have certainly shaped the way we think in such a way that it is just not how we can actually solve the problem of harm, unfortunately. And I think a lot of us who care deeply about how do we stop the question of how do we stop the perpetuation of harm have fallen into that trap and inadvertently caused more harm because we were lifting up our sword as the bearer of justice and trying to chop, like the violence that begets more violence. And I'm certainly not suggesting that certain modes of violence are not necessary, but that particular mode of violence seems to just be another replication of the master's tools, so to speak. So I did not want to do that.
Well, it also creates these conditions where if you are saying that you've experienced abuse in these like nuanced ways, then this pressure to articulate it in almost legal terms of like what specifically were the trespasses and what is the suitable accountability, quote unquote, that comes with those trespasses or harms or crimes. Portraying it as an experience and portraying it as an internal process and narrative kind of once again refuses that style of relationality that relies on signs and icons, and instead offers one that is more interested and implicated with the real.
Absolutely. And I would take it even one step further and like say that these words we like to throw around, abuser, victim, even in some cases harm, have become just as much a part of these signs we use removed from the real. And I think this is a part of why it is so hard to talk to a person who harmed you about the harm they caused. Because the minute you use any sort of accusatory language, they perceive this as the total implication of their identity. And now they're in war mode and they're trying to defend themselves. And it's like, I mean, yes, I do use strong language. I do call these people abusers, but I also take painstaking care to expose that I'm not using those words in the same way that people often use those words. And this even, boils down to how, some people did fight me about whether what I was calling abuse was even actually abuse. And a part of this is because we have engaged now as a social culture so much emphasis on what those words are allowed to mean that it's almost like unless the harm is, explicitly legible, it's not abuse. Which I think if any of us sit down and think about, like review any of our relationships across time, we would be able to say that, subtle forms of harm and abuse occur almost all the time. And we don't have to say it's our fault. We can actually deconstruct it from a sense of self-identity and reframe it as this is the byproduct of the system we have accidentally created for ourselves, which would then call for a revolutionary rewilding of the way we frame a lot of these words we use in everyday language.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to mention, I don't want this to be like too much about me or anything, but I wanted to mention that I have in the somewhat recently a partner of mine like told me that I was abusive in a relationship, and the journey that it took to to actually, I guess I'm just trying to say that I'm experiencing this from both sides, and I of what it means to bring up an abusive pattern or dynamic or relationship. And yeah, I just could very much feel the ways in which the discourse about abuse and harm was immediately pressing on my, body and my response, my nervous system, in a way where it becomes difficult to actually understand how and why those things happened if you are focusing on the sort of signs of abuse. And it also becomes this thing where it's like, okay, well, I guess I'm like the worst person ever. Like these, if I phrase it a certain ways, then okay, I'm like the worst monster I could think of. But then, and that can almost, like, if you were to go that route, it's almost like the Nicholandian accelerationist kind of, well, I guess I'm an horrible person, so I can just do whatever. And like, you know, like, I guess I've, like, if I can't be ethical, even though I thought I was being ethical, then like, you know, I guess I can just be an awful person. But then it's like, no, like the actual ethics are from an ongoing wrestling with the things that are like painful and that like make for some radical grief about who you thought you were and like what dynamics were playing out. I just to kind of like articulate it from the other side, and also to kind of like, I'm interested in opening up conversations with people who have been abusive, because I think that that is kind of a realm of the real that gets really passed over because everyone's so afraid of being an abuser, you know, or being bad. And I think it's also interesting that you actually implicate the figure of the monster and the figure of badness quite a bit in these essays.
I love the quote from Simone Weil, which is that our badness is, you know, just a revelation of our contradiction. I think I'm misquoting it, but that's the paraphrase. That our badness comes from our contradictions. And like I think that's really what you're exposing here, which I think it's beautiful that you're articulating, you know, that very thing of like you had a theory and an ethics of care, but when a particular kind of embodied knowledge hit you, it radicalized the way that you were thinking about that very same intellectual knowledge.
Yep. No.
And
yes. Yeah. You mentioned like the theoretical understanding of things, and then like the embodied understanding of them, almost being impossible to know unless you have something like this, like shared with you, or like, yeah.
Absolutely. And I mean, like I am and I think that to me that's a part of me saying, oh well, I'm a creature, I'm a monster, is that I embrace my badness. I embrace my badness. I'm telling you from the start, I'm a little bit dangerous.
Right.
I carry contradictions. You may not always receive the same self today that you received yesterday. And I think it's ridiculous for any of us to say we have never caused harm. We have never been abusive. I don't care. I don't care who you are. Nobody is perfect, and we never will be. No matter how much work you put into it, you will reveal your contradictions again, and you will be welcomed and opened into the embodied knowledge of a new radical way of thinking through that.
Yes.
To me, the quest isn't, I need to already know what is good and bad, but I need to somehow train my body to be able to receive information about how my contradictions might be affecting other people. And instead of lashing into a sense of urgency to reclaim a sort of pure identity, to be able to remain in that mud and play in that mud for a little while and say, can I be curious about what this reveals about me? Can I be curious about what this reveals about you? Can I be curious about, you know, new things that I might need to understand my nervous system needs, you know? And this could even boil down to the same thing almost on the other side, that I think like people who have experienced trauma are very quick to set like quote unquote trigger warnings, or you know, if you don't acknowledge that I need such and care, blah blah blah, when it's like, you know, on the opposite end, like we can always say that a revelation of our badness, or quote unquote contradictions born from trauma in this particular sense, is a part of that mud. I can't learn better ways of regulating my nervous system so long as I am constantly setting purity rules for everybody around me. Then my nervous system just stays deregulated because I'm not having that embodied experience of how to sit with intensity. So it really goes both ways. And this is again the dialectic. This is that refusal of a clean binary.
Yes. All the thinking can be expounded by listeners from there on that topic. But there's a lot more that I wanted. It's such an interesting one. But that being said, I think that we can actually get into the architecture of how we get that argument by looking at this this tripartite or triptych of essays. But I guess we never quite finished the thread of the contents of the exegesis. Do you think it's worth teasing those out a little bit? I think I'm particularly interested in this spirit possession concept and the ways in which this harm triangulated between, you said, occulture, occult communities.
The frame makes sense if you're already existing in the world of a culture. But if you're not already kind of situated within that frame, it runs the risk of you thinking I'm speaking in metaphor. When I am not speaking in metaphor, I was literally possessed. That's up for debate to a certain extent in my mind. Which I address in part 3. But the context is that I was involved in a group of people who all deeply, collectively shared a form of magical thinking, which I'm not affirming or denying as reality. I still believe in spirits, but I understand that that's not everybody's worldview. So, in the context of the community of people, the audience that I wrote the exegesis for, this is all collectively already believed and understood, that a witch or a magician or, a sorcerer or whatever can commune with spirits, have conversations with them, receive visions from them, etc. So when I frame that I was possessed, this is because within the magical system that I initiated into an African spiritual tradition of magic called Kimbanda. And this is who the priest Jesse is. My godfather in that tradition. It is wholly believed that these spirits are real. Sasha is an online personality who is marketed as this seer who can commune with the stars and the spirits of the stars. And part of what she claims to be able to do is tell you who your spirit core is. Be able to divine who are the spirits that stand beside you, which is so sexy to all of the witches out there. It's I want to be pacted with spirits.
It's so nice to have it be assigned. It's there's this deep desire to be known in a way where you're ooh, this is my group. Okay, now I can know what to look into.
But and not only that, but in my case, to be assigned something that was supposedly so grand and so great, among this group of people, the most idealized form of the spirit pacts is the spirit marriage with some sort of fairy king or angel king or whatever, and you are not only chosen by your fellow witches, but you have also been divinely chosen by this powerful being that's going to give you power, and all that sort of thing. And what essentially happened is that about 3 months after I initiated into Jesse's Kimbanda house, I started just freaking losing my mind. And it becomes contextual, and that's again what the last the last essay within the exegesis is about, is that I actually had to reach a point where I had to accept we may never know what actually happened. But Jesse basically told me through divination that the reason why I was losing my mind was because the spirit I had pacted with, which Sasha had told me, this is your spirit, husband. I had a dream about this spirit, and you are meant to be pacted to this beautiful peacock spirit. And then Jesse says, well, you were the idiot. You didn't set proper container when you did the pacting ritual. Sasha's not to blame here, but you pacted with a parasite, and it's your fault, and that's why you're sick, and you need you need an exorcism, and blah blah blah. And it goes even
I'm sorry, he said with a parasite. Is this peacock spirit like an actual? Is that a known quality of his or its or theirs or?
No, that's the point. Is that supposedly I had done, like, what Jesse's claim is, I had done something wrong when I went to do the ritual to pact with the peacock spirit. I accidentally pacted with a fairy.
Okay, like an imitator or like some sort of changeling style.
Yeah,
entity.
and it was mimicking, but it became complicated because Jesse was like, oh, well, it was never a peacock spirit, and it was never meant to be a spirit marriage. It was meant to be some great ancestor that reminded him of Rip Van Winkle, who was like still alive but asleep in the earth somewhere.
Oh
like,
my God.
I don't know. I look back on this now and I'm like, there was a series of spiritual psychosis going on.
Mm-hmm.
Whether I believe in spirits or not, like, this is why I'm like, this is why I used VALIS, Philip K. Dick's VALIS,
Yes.
as like
in
as
which
inspiration. Yeah, because
in which,
it's
for the
just
record, like he goes on this like very dysregulated but very like expansive spiritual quest that doesn't really have any answers, and gets him all tangled up with real world consequences as well. I mean, not to dismiss the real world, of the spiritual stuff that he was talking about, but yeah.
Well, that's the ambiguity, right? Like, the ambiguity is that we are left saying, I can't determine whether this was real or not. But what we can determine is that it was real to Dick, that it had real material consequences on him and his life, and even the legacy of his work. Because a part of the claim becomes all of these novels that he's writing are, also byproducts of his engagement with this pink light, this whatever it is, and that's the story we hear repeatedly throughout history when people are in engagement with spiritual beings, or they talk about being in engagement with spiritual beings. I forgot where I was going with that, but that it always has like embodied consequences in the experiencer. It's never just a vision alone. It always kind of comes accompanied with, this is why female visionaries, medieval female visionaries, then recasted as, she was a schizophrenic. Like she was and this is Anne Carson's point in one of her essays on mystics, is like, even Simone Weil is typecasted as like, just a bulimic. Like, there's something pathological about the way that they experience and talk about the sacred. And I think like a part of where I stand is that, like, yes, and this is actually the end point. Like, this is what the third speech is meant to kind of land on, is that like the sacred and the world as we know it is so much more stranger than we acknowledge or even can always perceive in normal modes of cognition. But that does not mean that high strangeness and high weirdness doesn't happen. The problem becomes when you try to name what it is and fix it into a particular thing and give that particular thing authority instead of just admitting, like, Dick had no idea what that pink light was. And he died not knowing what it was, regardless of the inspirational power it had on his life. And that's a bit different than saying, you know, with certainty, I know I was actually possessed by a parasite, because there's many other people have had many other ideas, diviners as well, like powerful and authoritative within their own traditions in their own right, who had completely different things to say about what they thought was happening to me. So the point of the exegesis is really, it's written for that particular audience, the audience of a culture who has turned spirituality into a form of consumerism and social status, you know, as if Pythia is akin to being a rock star, instead of the historical truth that most mystics and visionaries are generally tend to be typecasted as psychotics. You know, like that experience materially held in the body is not sexy. It is destabilizing. Makes you feel crazy. I was reading the other day about this former famous occultist. I believe his name was Blue Fluke. And, you know, he had written a whole comic on how to do chaos magic, and then somewhere down the line ended up in a psych ward. And it's just like, yeah, like there is this very fine line between I'm having a genuine visionary experience and I've lost my ability to participate comfortably in the social world.
Absolutely.
I wouldn't even say material, I would say social. Yeah.
Well, you also face all the different material power institutions. You know, you get hospitalized, you lose your job, et cetera, et cetera. And there's the callback to an early Mutant Manifesto episode with Ali Words, who talks about, we were talking about Eldritch, like evocation, like Eldritch, and this idea of like high versus low magic. But anyway, they had this concept of sane madness and insane madness, and they were,
I love that.
Yeah, they were distinguishing between sane madness as a type of madness that is affected by a kind of divine inspiration that is mind expanding and reality expanding or fracturing or whatever, but is also clean in a certain way that has a hygienic relationship to you. And then there's insane madness, which would be an unhygienic relationship to that expansiveness or that fracturing, one in which you do not have as much of a controlled isn't even the right word for it, but harmonious relationship with it. Yes, so like, yeah, these things are definitely abound. And it seems like, if I may quote again, this is towards the end of the exegesis, this is in the last section, you say, quote, "They simply assumed their certainty was care. That is not love, that is not healing, that is not priesthood, that is not even divination done properly. And I don't care how kind their voices were, how soft their words, how well-meaning they believed themselves to be. Control wrapped in gentleness is still control. Containment draped in silk is still a cage. And when I tried to say this doesn't feel right, they spoke the same curse always spoken against any prophet." Unquote. And so I think that kind of sums up this idea that it's almost like their certainty about what was happening and what was wrong, or what all these things about their own goodness, was kind of one of the most harmful parts of this relationship. It seems like it's like in a world where everyone, like, it's known to me, I think a lot of occultists are aware or should be aware of this edge, right? this dangerous edge where like this could be very harmful for somebody's actual life if it's not properly bounded or contained or prepared. But like this certainty that what they were doing, that they were in the right, that they are not responsible, right, was maybe part of what like created this harmful dynamic that continued to worsen because of their lack of engagement with it. Does that feel like a faithful kind of rendering?
Yeah, I would say like that is the underlining critique of all three speeches. Although like each of the people named are engaging with that form of like fixing me into an image on a different level. The one that you're quoting from, the reason why I'm talking about their, perceived goodness is because that speech was about two people who came in after, like, Jesse and Sasha's version of care had resulted in me becoming even worse, because by that point, whether or not I was quote unquote spirit sick or not, the amount of grief and like pain that I was experiencing is like human enough to cause madness on its own. But prior to that, prior to, engaging with Breyer and Amaya, I had simply just maintained that like Sasha's harm was really more what you just named. That she had told me to marry this spirit, that she had named all of these things for me, and she had no responsibility when things went wrong. It was all my fault when things went wrong. That was the only thing I was really putting on Sasha, which is, of course, here's who we get back to this distinction between what is allowed to be abuse, because that wasn't strong enough. That wasn't something people would latch on to. Nobody wanted to name that as harm, fixing me into an image. And this is really what Love is the Loss and, Love Under Will in particular spends a long time trying to explain, is like the harm that comes from creating fixed images, even though we don't like whether or not the image is an idealized person or a monstrified person. It is still harm because we have turned a subject into an object, and we are no longer engaging with them in their ever-changing self, in their expansive multiplicity. We have reduced them to a single image. The issue was that by the time Breyer and Amaya came in, I was already deeply vulnerable and alienated and ostracized, and at that point just grasping and craving for even just bare minimum friendship, anything that felt like water. And so I do not think that I would have fallen for this out, in any other instance, but at this particular time in my life. And here's another good example of where we're always a changing self. You might not meet the same me today who you met yesterday. At that particular time, I was vulnerable to this particular form of manipulation, which is that they came in and they said, well, we've done divination about it, and Sasha actually intentionally made you sick. Sasha is some sort of great evil who is making a whole bunch of all the people that she sees as clients sick. And then, now they're exacerbating what I like to call my justice boner, and bringing and making it that other people are in danger of going through this exact same terrible thing that I had gone through. And I think I wasn't comfortable enough with instability, and I was very vulnerable, and that felt like a thing to latch on to, that A, gave me grounds, and B, allowed me into a new circle where I felt like, oh, I'm receiving care. As long as I agree that Sasha is an abuser in the total ideal platonic form of what an abuser is meant to be, then I am allowed to be talked to. I am allowed to be told this shouldn't have happened to me. All these other smaller forms of care that I deeply needed. And at one point
Ooh,
I
ooh.
did reorient. This was the thing, like I did end up reorienting. I did regain my sea legs, so to speak. I became brave enough to claim my sea legs is maybe a better way to phrase this. And I was able to say, hey, wait a minute, like, I see what this is, and like, this is actually still you guys imposing a particular narrative onto the situation that behooves really you guys, because they were competitors of maybe not of real money, but of social capital within the occult world at large.
Right.
And it behooved them to, you know, label Sasha as this great enemy as a way to kind of dethrone this star queen, you know, so to speak. So that did infuriate me. But it's something we see all the time. Like Paulo Freire brings this up in Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and I often label it as the kind, you know, it's neoliberal care is really what it is. It's like this idea that like, my goodness is to come in as the savior and save you as the victim, and aren't I so amazing and wonderful and good for being the one who saves you, which, you know, when you actually sit and deconstruct that, has completely removed me as the subject. I no longer have sovereignty. I am merely an object who is now quote unquote the victim within the story they are telling. So that, you know, this is to me all about different ways that we can come to understand what objectification really is. And so long as you are objectifying me, you are not engaging with me, you know, within the real. You have turned me into a sign. I meant to signify something. And whether or not that signification even matches up with the real is no longer relevant. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that infuriated me.
Yeah, I hear you.
This is my thing. It's like, I would rather be in my badness than someone who insists on goodness in that way.
Yes. And I think the reality is that that's pretty rare. And there's something about I mean, I guess it just is the like liberal order, the neoliberal order that we live in, that atomizes and makes everything like a status play, and flattens complexity and flattens like actual material kind of understandings of things. I don't mean that just like just in like an economic way, as you were saying, but like the material relationships of desire networks and of psychological and subconscious networks, that whole nexus, like that creates our realities, our social realities, and our, you know, experiences of reality to begin with, like that all becomes atomized and flattened into this like simulation, or like all these simulacra and like programming languages almost, when what you need a lot of the times is then substituted and alienated by those forms of relationality, rather than addressed and sat with. And that's just a deep, honestly, like crisis, I think, within the like dominant culture in much of the world, or at least in in America, you know. I would imagine the West, so to speak, in general.
Yeah. No, totally. I think. Oh no, go ahead.
I think that like I can relate to it because it's like I don't know. I think that it's funny. I think like from an early age, I've been thinking about this. My intellect and my ability to predict behaviors and my ability to empathize, and figure what's about to happen, what escalation is about to happen, what kind of emotional blow up is about to happen, was something that I was able to survive through, or in a way, or sort of like navigate my surroundings through. And as a result, I think that my I almost, for my own psychology, I constantly route feelings into thought, and I constantly I almost like solve the problem. I try to solve the problem of my feeling before I even feel it. And I think that in general, that fits within a world that it very much encourages you to live in a symbolic existence. And I do think that that kind of tendency is part of how I fell into an abusive pattern. And I think that in general, also with myself, I think that like real pleasure, which I think is like the point of it all, only exists through an implication with the actual, like, staying with the feeling in a way that cannot be inscribed, and like seeing what transforms and what moves after, like, usually there's a lot of grief or whatever, some sort of negative feeling, but that transformation, that alchemy, seems to bear like the you know the most interesting or delicious fruit in terms of like vitalizing my lived experience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. I love that you use the word alchemizing, because I mean, to me, that would be my immediate response to what you were saying about this like process of intellectualizing your feelings. One of the things when I first started learning about astrology that I really loved was the idea that like I could understand better how different people processed their emotions by knowing what their moon sign
I mean,
was.
my moon's in
And
Capricorn, so yeah.
yeah, like Saturnal setting limits.
Mm-hmm.
Mine is in Aquarius.
Mm.
Um, so I am also doing a lot of that, where like the main thing you'll see when people write about Moon in Aquarius is like the potentiality for them to intellectualize their feelings and not like feel their feelings. This is like funny because it kind of goes to like if I had to say what I think happened to
Mm-hmm.
me,
Mm-hmm.
it no longer becomes even necessary to define whether I actually got spirit sick or how I got spirit sick or not. Because what I think happened is that prior to all of this, I was doing pretty much continuous magic for
Mm.
almost 2 years,
Mm-hmm.
asking to complete the great work because I only theoretically knew what that meant. It's like this
Oh.
is the it's like I theoretically knew what I was asking for and I desired
Mm-hmm.
that. But I did not really know on an embodied level what the experience of Negrito was actually going to be like. So whether or not it was an actual parasite or this I don't have to go into all the other things different diviners have said about it, but regardless of what actually made me sick, I think it was all happened because I had been asking to go through the alchemical process. And by whatever means that occurred, that's certainly what occurred. Because, of course, in this very synchronistic way, it was all happening while I was in Texas at my grad program writing about the alchemical process. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm like actively having this beautiful experience where I'm, in this container where I'm, expected to theorize and think and research about what these phenomena might mean in both a embodied level and a theoretical level. And then I was also literally experiencing it in my body at the
Mm.
same time. So the beauty of this oscillation between mind and body, sun and moon, the marriage of these two supposed quote unquote opposite things is actually what produced the alchemical understanding and the alchemical becoming. I was only able I am only able to sit here and talk to you today in the language that I have now because I engaged with this from both levels of knowledge production. And then I digested and married the two of them over a long period of time, through multiple Negrito and albino moments. Honestly, like that's another thing they don't tell you is that it doesn't all happen in one fluid motion. But yeah, I do not think that the problem is actually intellectualizing emotions, and that's why I brought up the astrology, because if we accept, and I'm not saying you have to, but if you accept the premise that, astrology reveals something about the world, if you accept the premise that the tarot reveals something around the world or about the world, all the elements have their place and all the elements are intermingling. We're not meant to be talking about or even experiencing water just as water. And brings us back to the original question about uh, my costuming and my response about garmeting, because and I do bring this up in, I believe it's the second essay, Love Under Will, is that we almost require this mediation because the intensity of change, the intensity of becoming
Right.
is too much for us to digest. Feel it like water alone is you're gonna drown. You cannot just feel the feeling. You need to learn how to process it through all the other elements, through fire, through air, through earth. And it is only through pouring all of these supposed disparate parts into one container and watching this new item that they produce when they're mixed, that we actually have an idea of what a quote unquote new stage of becoming could possibly be.
That's very fair. I think that it's also kind of funny to be like trying to get to like complete the great work, whatever, because as I understand it, that's kind of a very classic alchemist journey of like wanting to get there and then only to realize that like it's just a continual process, right? But then also like, yeah, I mean, I think you're right. Like I'm glad that I can intellectualize my feelings sometimes. I'm not a believer that I want to be fully sensitive all the time because that shit's not livable. But at the same time, I think that I'm just trying to make the point that I feel like the culture that I live in, it does incentivize a symbolic existence wherein I can just live very anesthetized, and like literally erase or elide all the negative feelings I have or all the feelings in general, and live in a symbolic world. And I think that, so I'm just saying that like maybe some tempering of that, some introducing some of the fire, introducing some of the water into that like airy and earthy mix is also just important for the for the insight to really come and stuff.
Absolutely agree. No, I do. I call that quote unquote purity morals. That we could somehow be pure of all that hurts us and all that destabilizes us, and like there's that very oh my gosh, I used to know the word for it, but I'm gonna blank on it. But it's like the posture that monks take, like that I can somehow discipline myself away from my desires.
Oh, like
Um,
asceticism or whatever.
yeah. Well, that's not the word I'm looking for, but that is like the mode that it comes to be practiced through. I don't know that it matters what the technical
Yeah.
term is. The thing to me about what you're pointing out is that we have a desire for transcendentalism. We don't want to, it's like, like what does it really mean that we're replacing the real with signs? What does that really mean if we stop using these abstract words? is really just saying that we would rather engage in a transcendental, purified mode of the real instead of living in what is messy and dirty. And, I think it's interesting because we have this story of the Garden of Eden and a lot of this, these soteriological frameworks that Abrahamic models circle around is like, oh, we want to return to this Edenic state, as if gardens are not full of dirt and rot and bugs. It's so silly if you actually think about it. It's like they're not. You're kind of sidestepping what a garden even actually is by refusing it its mess.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So we've talked about these, we've talked about the exegesis, we've done a preamble about philosophical tenets that we are drawing on, that you are working with. But now I think that it's time to turn to this triptych of essays that you wrote, essentially metabolizing that experience and refracting it, so to speak. So, yeah, can you kind of introduce this this trilogy of essays, these 3 essays, before we go into the first one more specifically?
Yeah. So the first thing I will say is that actually, I would say that these essays were only at least consciously, moderately in part inspired by the, same experiences from the exegesis. And that's why, earlier in this, I was like, oh, I was a little surprised to kind of see that, at the very least, the Sasha speech is really bringing up a lot of the fucking same exact things. Although I guess I did kind of know that I brought up phantoms in both. But really, the main thing that I consciously knew was inspired by a precedent is not even really super brought up in the exegesis. There were
I'm sorry, 1 second.
a lot more people involved and a lot more stories to tell.
You broke up there for a second.
Oh, am I back? I'm not going anywhere.
Can you try saying
Maybe
some things
I
again?
am too far. Can you hear me right now?
Yeah, that's a lot clearer.
Yeah, the only thing that I knew for certain that I talked about in both was the phantom, but until I reread it the other day, at least the Sasha speech, I didn't realize how much they were really talking about the same thing, because on a particular level, I was inspired by different situations. Although maybe, and this is going back to what I was saying about, through the abuse that I experienced, I kind of lost my ontological grounds and them from the ground up through my thesis, which ended up, kind of becoming an alchemical marriage for me, or a particular version of completing the great work. But at a certain point at Rice, I decided I needed to start taking art classes. And I took a class on sound art, and through that and through the exploration of the different texts we were reading in that class, I was being exposed to kind of media studies people, which is a completely different world than anything I had really fully dived into before. And they were talking about the epistemology of sound. And like, and Carson was kind of also talking about the same thing in Autobiography of Red, and I had this like crazy, what is it called? Synchronicity moment where, through taking the sound art class, I ended up uncovering things I had been missing in Carson's work and in my own thesis. And to make a I also really love making sound art. So to like make a long story short, I ended up kind of deciding I want to really think this is what I want to transition my academic studies into. Like, I want to go get a PhD and work on the epistemology of sound. And so I, of course, am taking some time off because after like going through grad school while also going through intense traumatic experience and also multiple deaths, like my dad died and my cat died. And it was just a lot. So, like, I'm taking time off, but I still kind of want to think through these things because I'm crazy and that's what I like to do for fun. So, I just basically started trying to ask how to rebuild a theory of ethics once we accept, like, if we accept that there's no self, or we accept that the self is intra-related. And this is like where the yummy stuff from Meeting the Universe Halfway, which you've already kind of had a guest who brought up this kind of form of feminist relational ethics. But I just started trying to work that out, not in a academic way, but just if I were just writing out a stream of conscious, how like Descartes would have done it back in the day without all of these extra academic limitations, how would I think through this problem? And I wonder sometimes, like, if a part of like me talking about the phantom again is just because that is the word that I inherited to talk about this, because I got all of that actually. I guess I'll explain to the listener what it is, but it's the idea that there is like an actual like imaginal actor who is used to mediate the intensity of the real. And we're kind of always doing this, creating this phantom, which is a word that Renaissance magicians would use. And I like inherited this language through reading Jan Kulianu's Eros and Magic in the Renaissance. And the idea is that like this mediated spirit is like the thing that translates the heart to the mind so that the mind can apply language to it. And I've kind of been talking about it as these fixed images, these like ideas that we decide things are, because we cannot like intellectually hold the complexity of form in its entire multiplicity. We can't like linguistically even talk about that. We have to pin things down and name them in a way that makes them communicatable, even if they kind of extend beyond what language allows us to say. I think like that, and just the fact that I was trying to explore like, can sound actually overcome this problem that we've become like trained. And this is also, I'm inspired by Bataille. I love George Bataille. I don't want to say that my reading of Story of the Eye is the correct one, but like I believe that Story of the Eye, beyond just trying to like show you that form slip and cannot actually, that all forms contain excess, and also besides just being really graphic porn. I think the reason why he calls it Story of the Eye and why the eye is the emphasis is because Bataille is also highlighting the same problem of desire that Jan Kulianu is talking about in Eros and Magic, which is basically that Renaissance magicians realized that if they could trick you into mistaking the phantom for the real, then they could manipulate you or change conditions or, put you under a glamour or something. And this is like a part of how they understood magic to work. And then Jan Kulianu's claim, I'm not saying this is 100% right, although I tend to believe it, and I do plan to do an essay where I kind of trace out this history because it's something that comes up in some other books on occult and politics as well, but that, modern day advertising inherits a lot of these same ideas and techniques where they're constantly throwing images at you and telling you what the image of the form of idealized desire is, and they're throwing it at you with so much repetition, and they're depositing it into you as if it's straight fact that you just and this Jan Kulianu brings this up also. It's like puritanic values, the way that the West, whether or not like anyone identifies as a Puritan or, even a Christian, we've all kind of inherited Puritan values. And a part of this is the reduction of our use of imagination, the, value of embracing the rational over this more imaginal quality of the human spirit, for example. And so Jan Kulianu is saying that because of these two things, because we aren't really encouraged to utilize imagination anymore, and then advertising models are the ones like depositing the images into us, we are now estranged from our actual true desires, which have become replaced by what advertisers and, shareholders want us to believe is desirable. So those essays do deal with that problem, but they deal with that problem through a particular lens, which is like that I accept Karen Barad and other relational ontologists, insistence, and this is also similar to a Buddhist idea that every one of us ourselves, when we say there is no self, that is not to say that there is not a subject who experiences selfhood, because there obviously is, but we misidentify that self as a wholly independent being instead of understanding that the self, the will, is actually arising out of the relational matrix, the relational field. We are all actually bound to each other by historical and material and linguistic and social conditions. So nobody, they call it in Buddhism, they call it codependent arising. Right. Nobody arises independently. You have a co-origin with everyone around you. So this is like nuancely different than saying we all are one, because just saying we all are one kind of allows still, like, I am an individual expression of the monad. Whereas this idea of interaction or interdependence is more like saying, I only exist because of my relation with you. And so that's kind of what I'm calling love, is this matrix, this web of relation that each of our experiences of self originate from. And that, in my mind, because I used to hang out with a lot of OTO, because I was hanging out with a lot of OTO members, which is Aleister Crowley's occult group, his maxim is love is the law, love under will, do what thou wilt. And one of the issues that I kept having with people in the OTO is that they would basically say to me, like, well, that's not my will, so I'm not going to do it. Do what thou wilt. And it's the same kind of thing that Jesse used to say to me. Jesse would say, no one owes you anything. Nobody owes you anything. As if that was meant to kind of imply, like, you are meant to pick yourself up and rise yourself out of trauma alone, by yourself, quietly, without making too much trouble for anybody else, because this is the puritanic model. You should be able to pick yourself up by your bootstraps and make your millions yourself, right? This is very American.
Yeah, I
And
mean, yeah, if you it's also like, you know, that's where a lot of new age like beliefs sprout from. This idea that you can independently will something into being.
exactly. And I kept wanting to scream at people when they would say any variation of this to me and be like, no, actually, we owe each other everything.
Right.
But they kept, of course, misunderstanding what I mean by that. They don't realize I'm literally saying on an ontological level, I would not exist without you, and you would not exist without me. And the way you are treating me right now is going to affect your entire self-formation in the future, no matter how much you want to escape from it or escape from me. And I don't have to do anything at all, because that's just the way memory works. That's just the way grief works. That's just the way time is. So all of these urges, all of these different thoughts and different things are like, okay, I'm going to start trying to write out like my own version of ethics, starting with this problem. And I just thought it was really interesting when I was thinking about interaction and interdependence, and the way that this doesn't mean no self, it means I am a codependent arising self. I had this realization. I was like, oh my God, love under will. Where I was like, love is the soil, is the foundation from which the will even generates and arises. So to do what thou wilt is still, is, love is still the law. That it's
Right.
not, it doesn't become secondary.
The will
And
arises through the
so,
soil of this interaction that you're calling love, which is the law. So,
yes,
yeah.
yes. And so because of that, should we not try to understand what doing what thou wilt might mean while still respecting that law of interaction? So that is what the three essays are kind of trying to do.
So they're intervening in this idea of will as something that can even be understood accurately as independent.
Absolutely, yes, 100. That's pretty much the main point.
Yeah.
And then the actual ethics that come up from that, right? Because I've had other friends who study Buddhism. They want, the way they respond to my abuse story was like, well, if there's no absolute truth and I'm not actually going to label anybody because I'm beyond good and evil, therefore, I cannot decide who was the abused and who was the abuser, so I will neutrally remove myself from the situation at hand and not take a side. And, you need to understand that that's, me being the middle way. And I'm just like, this again, you're still misunderstanding, because you're still positing that your independent self can somehow be removed from the relational field.
Right, right.
You know what I mean?
Or that you can really efface the self. Like there's, since we experience this stuff, like the selves that we have like exist, even though they are constructed, they do still very much exist and have experiences that are like real. So
Absolutely.
that's kind of the tricky thing where there's so much emphasis on this like egolessness, but it's like, well, that's kind of the same thing as saying that you're just a good person, when in reality, of course you harm people. It's like, oh, I'm actually so egoless, but it's like, well, like you can say that, but like that might be ignoring something that is
Totally.
just just there, just relating to others. Yeah. I mean, I think that's a pretty I do recommend once again reading these essays, because they actually spell this all out with the the care and time necessary to like really understand it all. But I think that you've done a good job summarizing it. I want to, in the last few minutes, like I'm curious if we can kind of ground this a little bit. And there's a couple of things that, and also you have this also, just for the record, there is a podcast episode on Chimera podcast that you do that goes through this entire journey through like a sonic, it's like an experimental like form of a podcast in which you go through all these things and talk about all the essays and read from the essays and do some spell work and stuff. And I really recommend that as well. It's a really beautiful piece that if you want to just get it all through auditory means, I recommend that, listener. But there's some threads that I wanted, I was kind of curious about within that. And I think they're a little bit more grounded in a certain way. So you have this motif of lava, of magma, boiling up. And I wonder if you can contextualize that motif a little bit and talk about why you sit with it.
Why I choose to use the volcano as a metaphor?
Yeah. Particularly interested in the affect that it is trying to enact, or that it describes.
Sure. It is used as an affective device, certainly. Oh, as always, I am a relational self. I codependently, all of our thoughts have ancestors. And this particular one is, again, just Anne Carson, because Volcano is pretty much the main, well, there are maybe more than one main symbols in her book, Autobiography of Red. But it's definitely, up there. It's the one that's literally used on the cover of the book is a picture of a volcano. And so I did become, I'm writing about this book on an academic level for my thesis. So I'm doing a lot of research on volcanoes, and volcano in this context is being used as an affective device to kind of demonstrate the embodied experience of the main narrator, Garion, in the story. And the I think the main thing that I learned from Volcano is Volcano kind of is a representation of this alchemical marriage where Volcano is both a phallic symbol and a vaginal symbol. It is completely tumultuous on the inside and strong and sturdy on the outside. But what is also very interesting about Volcano is that, when they sit and all of this stuff that's happening inside of them, the tectonic plates crashing into each other, the different chemicals and gases, the heat, all of that reacting to create magma and lava. All of this is kind of a representation of you can think about this as a symbol for what is affectively going on in a person when they are being forced to be silent and to hold this purity posture until at least this is my read. Again, I don't want to put words in Carson's mouth because I think she also is very intentionally ambiguous, allowing the reader to kind of put their own meaning into certain things. But for me, and I will go back and say this is definitely a part of it with her because she does a lot of talking about silence and the violence of silence and the need for refusal as well. But the eruption of the volcano is the refusal. It's the moment that you say, no, I will not be silent anymore. I cannot keep all of this inside of me anymore. And the volcano will erupt and the magma will then clear out. Here's your Negrito phase. It will clear out everything and then it hardens into new land. And over time, that land becomes fertile again and new ecological structures grow on top of what had been previously scorched and burned away. So Volcano is a destroyer and a creatrix. So it carries a lot of these dialectical properties where it is always kind of a both and. And in a way, it kind of represents. A lot of people like to tie this into the feminine, which I do think it happens to women a lot. But Garion is a genderless, genderly ambiguous character. So I don't think it necessarily has to be woman, but it does kind of represent those who are made to receive, those who are felt to be objectified or othered, or asked to be silent and hide their differences and all these things. And that moment of eruption, when you finally have to just kind of say, I have to burn this down and create new land. So I do think I use Volcano a lot in that way. And the affect is really just coming from like the idea that when you hold these things inwards and you try to contain all the pressure, it's bound to erupt. And a part of like what I'm interested in then is like how do we allow for the creation that comes after that eruption to be generative, to be more nourishing than what was there before, rather than, just letting it kind of destroy willy-nilly, or to just kind of destroy and then have the exact same ecosystem grow back in that place. So I think this is like where art comes in, is like, and what I was saying earlier, where about like feelings actually do need a container. When you hold that much pressure and weight and clashing images of the self, and you're trying to hold it all down, like it's bound to erupt. But if you just like become more attuned to your own self-regulation, your body's own self-regulation, and what kind of forms the body is actually asking for you to express those feelings in, as opposed to like, we can all imagine times in which we held our tongue and didn't say something because we didn't want conflict, or we didn't want to cause a problem, or we wanted to be perceived as good, until we couldn't handle the situation anymore, and we caused a lot more damage than we were ever intending in that eruption than if we had just voiced our opinion 6 months prior. I think that's pretty universal. um all of these things are related to Volcano.
Yeah. I mean, that's yeah, a beautiful rendering of, again, like Volcano, not just as metaphor, but as like enactment, right? And this idea of like having containers for feelings and for thoughts and for communication as an artful
Yeah.
process seems also like a good call to like action, or like a takeaway. I guess I also, maybe as a kind of final question, I'm just curious if you want to share what your experience of like love is feeling like these days. A couple times throughout the work, you've mentioned in the essays and stuff, like this idea that to love is somewhat to harm. And that kind of also squares with what we kind of started this whole discussion with a little bit, about like incarnation, like the grief of incarnation, not just the grief of death, but the grief of birth, And I know love is like a multifaceted thing, but I'm kind of asking, like, I don't know, do you want to talk about what your experience of love is like now, kind of having gone through this writing and this work?
um you know I think that when to like, yes, I do think that love has a quality of it that is implicitly going to quote unquote harm, but I think this is like where we need to stop just saying words and maybe try
Mm-hmm.
to like be more clear about what we actually mean, because with like what I'm saying, what I am distinguishing as harm versus quote unquote rupture. So like love is always going to cause a rupture. And this is why I think, to protect ourselves from this existential fear of being annihilated by the other, um to grasp at a fixed self, has caused us to fear any form of change that might occur to the self. And because the self forms through relation, with every relation that we allow ourselves to experience in the real, or even if we're trying not to experience it in the real, it still changes us. It destroys who we were before, it clears a ground, and it creates something new. And we have a very hard time digesting that as a truth. Not because I don't think we can, but because I don't think we've been trained with how to hold that emotion. And I am distinguishing that rupture from what I would call harm. Harm is when we remove another person out of their subjecthood and turn them into an object, when we sever ourselves from the relational process and try to project the self or other into a transcendental. I think as soon as we start doing that, then we are engaging in harm. I do not think that is love. I think that is, a representation of being existentially opposed to the condition of love. But I do think love causes rupture. My experience of love prior to all of this happening was a lot more like I will do anything to help the person I love. I would do anything for them. I would martyr my own life for them. But this is where I was abusive. There are times in which I was idealizing the person that I loved. They were everything. They were the transcendental beloved object. And that removed them of their own subjectivity, and they became the beloved object. And that's not fair or sovereign for them. And it was just me engaging with a phantom. And I could not see the person I loved for who they truly were, because I was engaged in relation with a phantom. So, I think we can all notice times in which we've done this, because I think this is the modality we've all been trained to do things in. Just going back to saying, there's no reason to have guilt over this. It's just notice your dissatisfaction and say, okay, how can I train myself to handle ambiguity differently so that I don't need to fix this person into something holy in order for them to matter. So then love becomes both uglier and simpler and softer than what it was before.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really beautiful place to leave this conversation. Unless you have more things that you want to talk about.
No, I think that's a really good place to leave it too. Yeah. Just the last thing I'll say is just that's why, instead of keeping love in an abstraction as some sort of idealized feeling or idealized behavior that's so holy and outside of this human world, to just reframe love as this matrix of relation already reorients you, where you can kind of train yourself to think about this differently. And it's not going to be a immediate conceptual shift, but your body can start responding to love differently once you start naming it differently, because names have power. So that was the intention of kind of trying to frame love in this way in the essays. And that's all I'll say.
These four written works and the auditory one are a really rigorous and considered take on all that, and I think it's immensely helpful to it was very helpful for me to read, and I highly recommend everyone do. And I'm just like, thank you for like doing the work to set this all down into words.
Well, wow. I mean, thank you for reading. Like that makes me feel, very, very good because that was the point, is to say something that could, maybe help inspire other people. And it is very rigorous, and I know I am asking a lot of the readers, so like my deep gratitude to you. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna take credit for writing it all down in the way that you're naming, only because I'm just gonna admit, like, this is what I enjoy doing. But that's really what I think is a part of,
why
like,
can't it be both? Why can't you take credit for the
exactly,
rigor and
yeah.
also be like, yeah, I also really liked doing it?
Well, that's what I really would love for people to start thinking about marks, like each according to their means. Like, yeah, like this is just literally what my mind wants to do. Just let me do this and engage with me
Oh
here
my God.
because this is where my labor is the most productive.
I have so much. I mean, I really enjoy engaging with you as a speaking person too. I mean, it's really nice. I thank you so much for talking to me. And yeah, like I was saying on our smoke break, like it's nice to speak with somebody who has that intellectual rigor that's applied to esoteric questions, as well as like a leftist materialist understanding of things and a critical theory analysis as well. And it's also just it's really nice to have the discussion, and I appreciate you sharing the time and thought with me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jackie. It is very nice to speak to somebody who plays the same language game.
Yeah. Okay, so people can go to SaturnVox.com for a lot of your stuff. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct people?
Well, just to make clear, and once you get on the SaturnVox page, you're gonna wanna click on, I think it's under offerings, and then autobiography of a halfling is my blog. So that's where you'll find the essays, and then the other one is on my podcast, which is called Chimera, but it's spelled Khimara, which is the Greek spelling. And yeah, like I'm collecting people's grief stories. So if anybody wants to submit a grief story, feel free to go head on over to the podcast portion of the offerings page, where you can click a link and it will send you to a little submittable box where you can, tell me that you would like to tell a story. And yeah, that's where you find me.
Okay. Well, thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Jackie.
All right. Until next time, everybody.
The children kneel in dust and send it humming into motion. The monstrous vermin scatter. Kafka's philosopher runs breathlessly after the top. Already he reaches for it. Already he wants to stir the blur into something graspable. To close his fist around the bright little vertigo. Yet delight lives in the spinning itself. The moment the top stops dancing, it becomes only the idea of play. His curiosity remains dissatisfied as the monsters again gather around him, their many legs scratching at the root of his eye. Or was it his groin, or inside his navel? He scarcely has time to pinpoint their location amidst the frenzied shadows. The Greeks call Eros lack, yet the experiential texture of Eros as it undulates across my body resists the simplicity of deprivation. When I am within the passion of love, I do not rest. My body trembles, melts, loses coherence. Sensation multiplies. My will becomes increasingly animated by the distance between myself and what I want to be as a lover. My spirit flushes and yearns to be as like God. Let there be light. Create. I am. Creator. My desire does not merely impoverish me. It heightens my perception. For the poor shall inherit the kingdom on earth, and in rebellion I will disorder the stillness. I love it when Sappho's tongue breaks. Thin fire moves beneath her skin. Her senses lose their ordinary hierarchy. Sight, sound, touch, heat, motion begins spilling into one another. I am so full. The cicadas terrify me. They sing themselves outside history. They no longer hunger. They no longer wait. They no longer suffer the humiliation of distance. They pop out of the ground and they sing, they sing, they sing. What an ecstasy. The song feels sacred, so nothing interrupts it. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing interrupts it. Nothing reaches them anymore. They can't be bothered to stop singing. Their little bodies become sealed cathedrals of sound. And after 3 days of forgetting to eat, they pass away still singing. A teenager from Asheville will collect their bodies from the ground and attach their wings to jewelry she sells on Etsy. At least they were never hungry. The heart understands long before philosophy does. It contracts, it releases. It contracts again. A pause lives inside every proof of life. When I flatline, does life disappear, or only the interval through which I learned to move through it? I can't make a sound unless there is inhale, exhale. If I cannot make a sound, surely the screaming will turn itself inside out and eat me for breakfast. It is only in the interval I am given strength to beat my chest, cries of pride. I exist perhaps as something holy only through time, keeping rhythm to mark my duration. Infinity as eternal recurrence. Every living thing I have ever loved moves by meeting in the corner spaces where inside-outside meet. Tides, lungs, language, grief, migration patterns, menstrual blood, sleep. Even stars survive by tearing themselves apart. I think this is why lovers touch each other with such terror. To touch requires two surfaces remaining strange to one another. Repetition, difference. Repetition, difference. Repetition, difference. Dissatisfied when the top stops humming, alienated from my own pleasures once it's secured in my back pocket. Let them keep spinning. I'm curious, so the skin must continue translating.
this is exactly the shit that spirits feed off.